morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In my speech this morning, I'm going to comment on some trends in global governance. That's the governance we need in order to tackle challenges which are beyond the capacity of nation states to resolve on their own. As we all know, it's close to a century ago since the League of Nations was founded to promote world peace and cooperation. And it was the first global organisation with such a broad-based mandate. Although we can trace origins of some of these sectoral organisations like the International Telecommunication Union and the Universal Postal Union back to the mid-19th century. History, of course, records that the League of Nations wasn't successful, among other things, in not being able to prevent the outbreak of World War I. The multilateral framework, as we know today, was formed as that catastrophe neared its end. The United Nations in 1945 to promote peace, human rights and development, and the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944 in the economic and financial fields. Of course, our world has changed a lot since 1944 and 1945. But these groundbreaking institutions endure, and they have a lot of achievements to their credit. From the UN itself have come this substantial body of international law and norms across so many fields, and the practical humanitarian and development work. Indeed, the UN is credited by the UN Intellectual History Project as having been an incubator of new and powerful ideas which have shaped policies around the world, not least in promoting gender equality and human rights more broadly, the concept of human development as an alternative to measuring GDP per capita as a sole measure of development progress. And then there were the Millennium Development Goals, which caught the world's imagination and paved the way for the ambitious Sustainable Development Goals launched in 2015. In the peace and security realm, despite so many tensions through the Cold War period and the build-up of substantial nuclear weapons arsenals, war between the major powers didn't occur. And the UN played a role in supporting decolonisation, leading to the expansion of its membership from the 51 founders to the 193 member states today. But while the post-war institutional framework has proved to be enduring, always questions will be asked as to whether it is fit for purpose in the second decade of the 21st century. My own judgment would be that it isn't broken, but it must be continually refreshed. Where organisations don't reinvent themselves, and as new challenges are emerging, others will always seek to fill a vacuum left by those who can't adapt. But if the basic framework is sound, as I think it is, then the focus should be on what needs fixing, and on the relationships between the structures established at the end of World War II and the emerging institutions. So how are we doing in the key areas of global governance? In the economic area, we have seen the G20 meeting at leaders level emerge to fill what was a glaring gap. For example, as the global financial crisis unfolded, no single institution was empowered to act to avert the consequences. And while the G20 doesn't have formal power to direct global economic and financial regulation, the truth is that when the decisions of a group of major economies representing 85% of world GDP are carried over into formal institutions, they do carry rather a lot of weight. Of course, that in turn too raises its questions around legitimacy, and so it has been encouraging to see over the years the G20's growing outreach to both the United Nations and a much wider range of countries for input. The UN and the international financial institutions are represented at a high level at the leaders and the other G20 summits, and their officials participate in many of the working groups which shape the discussions and eventually the communiques. And we've seen G20 chairs over the years go to great extent to involve many more voices. With respect to the international financial institutions, yes, they've had their debates about representation and voice for emerging and developing economies. But agreement to the IMF's 14th General Quota Review in late 2015 and the entry into force the next year were welcome steps forward, with more than 6% of the quota shares shifting to emerging market and developing economies. And the World Bank too has been following reforms which aim to increase developing country voice in their governance. Meanwhile, we've seen the range of finance available to developing countries broadening, and the founding of new intergovernmental institutions like the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank and others associated with major emerging market economies. On trade, perhaps the outlook is not quite so rosy, as the multilateral spirit which saw the conclusion of the GATT Uruguay round in 1993 and the launch of the World Trade Organization's Doha development round in 2001 hasn't yet carried through to conclusion of the Doha round. In these global trade negotiations, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and there have been a number of sticking points, with the consequence that less and less of the world's dynamic trade is covered by the multilateral rules. And there is a proliferation of the regional, sub-regional, and other trade agreements. These aren't particularly helpful consequences, and the small and the low-income economies are disadvantaged in negotiating with more powerful economies outside the multilateral framework. So in my view, this gap now in trade rules coverage and the growing inequity in trade governance definitely needs urgent attention. On development and on governing the global comments, I'm rather optimistic, particularly following the phenomenal agenda-setting year of 2015, which saw the finalisation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Agenda 2030, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on the financing for development, the huge progress with getting the Paris Agreement on climate change, and so on. Last year too, we saw new agreements, Habitat 4 in Quito on the new urban agenda, so vital as the world's population urbanises so fast. And also, interestingly, the development with the UN Summit on Refugees and Migrants, where clearly comprehensive responses are needed to the worst forcible displacement crisis we've ever seen, worse than that at the end of the Second World War. So then let me come to the other big pillar, the peace and security pillar of the UN. When I came to UNDP as the administrator in 2009, my briefing notes always told me that the number of armed conflicts in the world were down. And of course, the UN can certainly take its part of the credit for keeping the peace for decades. But from around 2011, we have seen a spike in the numbers of deadly conflicts. I don't need to underline that point in this region, in the Sahel, elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, nor to underline how serious the ongoing waves of terrorism fueled by violent extremism are. For a range of reasons, the UN hasn't found it easy to address the new waves of conflict. The older dispatch of sending off the peacekeepers where there was a peace to be kept is now often inadequate. The peacekeepers may be sent where there isn't a peace to keep, and they may not be equipped to act, or they may not have a mandate to act to stem violence. And in a number of the currently raging conflicts, there is no mandate for UN peacekeepers to be there at all. So I think that given that promoting peace and security is so at the core of the UN's mission, it is important to find ways to respond to what is driving the current spike in the numbers of conflicts. Of course, reform of the veto power of the Security Council would help, but is hard to achieve. So equally distant is reform of the permanent membership, yet a failure to update the UN's governance to recognise the changes of the past 70 plus years does affect perceptions. There have been some bright spots. I take the Security Council's backing in recent weeks of the actions of West African nations who worked so hard to see a peaceful transfer of power in the Gambia following elections. And where a regional organisation is resolute for peace and security, with the backing of the Security Council, good things can be achieved. I think it's also promising to look at the debate in the UN now on how to sustain peace. And we do need big picture thinking here. Peace is built and sustained through long-term developmental processes. It's surely no accident that many states which we see lapsing into deadly internal conflict have combinations of high levels of poverty and inequity, governance which isn't inclusive and doesn't reach out to the furthest corners of the land, and an absence of the rule of law. These are development deficits. They cannot be addressed overnight, but they must be tackled if we're to build a more peaceful world. And the breakthrough, I believe, with the new Sustainable Development Agenda is that it very much links the building of inclusive, just and fair societies with poverty eradication, tackling inequalities, and addressing environmental unsustainability. So, to conclude, we're now for global governance. I think the magnitude of the shared problems we have does require us to continually reinvigorate the multilateral institutions. I see this happening to a certain extent in the economic and financial area and around sustainable development and governance of the global commons. While the development agendas have moral, not legal force, nonetheless, it is very encouraging to see how nations, developed and developing, are taking the global development agenda to heart. And certainly encouraging to see how fast the Paris Agreement on climate change came into force. I believe the human rights pillar of the UN has also broken new ground since the formation of the Human Rights Council in 2006 and setting up the Universal Periodic Review mechanism, which all member states participate in. Nonetheless, from shrinking civic space in many countries to repression of freedom of speech, and all the way through, tragically, to war crimes and crimes against humanity, there are many assaults out there on human rights today. And the need to uphold human dignity is as urgent and imperative as it ever was. Final point, while effective global governance in the peace and security realm, I think, is struggling, among other things, from an inability to update key provisions in the UN Charter of 45, this shouldn't stop member states moving ahead with progressive agendas for addressing the root causes of conflict and using all available means to build and sustain peace. Our 2030 agenda boldly asserts that there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. So success in implementing this agenda will have long-term benefits for people and planet, for peace and security, and I believe for the legitimacy, relevance and credibility of the multilateral system. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Big thank you again to Ms. Helen Clark for kicking off day 2 in such spectacular fashion. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning for our panel on Innovation Belongs to the Youth. My name is Umar Butli, and I will be your moderator for this panel. I'm very excited to be here. Now, the panel is brought to you by DO, a company that, since its inception in 2007, has always been forward-looking, it's been focused on innovation and giving youth a platform. And that's exactly what this upcoming panel is about. We've heard a lot at the summit already about the importance for governments, for leaders, to give youth a voice. And I'm very privileged to have with me today 2 very young, very inspirational individuals, under 18, 2 young inventors who have already made a real impact on our world. So, without further ado, I'm going to share with you all a short video just to let you know what they're all about.
People talk about youth as the future. I believe youth is also the present. The current population of youth are very well educated. They will develop a resilient and competitive economy for the country. We would like the economic footprint of each one of these individuals to be as large as possible. We would like them to be employers themselves rather than job seekers. I believe the UAE has provided the best system I've seen so far anywhere. We like to build an economy which is based primarily on business people and inventors and engineers and people of leadership skills.
My name is Fatma Ali Al-Kaabi. I am 15 years old. I was awarded as the youngest Emirati inventor. I remember when my parents used to call me to watch my dad fix the TV. And after that, somehow I came up with a new invention called the photographer robot, Machinoid.
At your service.
Behind every invention, there is a story or something I went through and I wanted to solve. I like to invent to help people. When I first started, I always found people who tried to disappoint me because I was a girl, and I don't want any girl to doubt herself. I have many plans for the future. At the beginning, I want to graduate from school, get to a good college. My first goal, inshallah, for the coming 6 years, I want to be a youth minister. I still have plans and you'll hear about them soon, inshallah.
My name is Thomas Suarez, and I'm 17 years old. I think I've always just been fascinated by computers and technology, even just from a very young age. That led to my love of software development and then also hardware engineering. I taught myself app development through online tutorials and playing around with other people's code. There's so much you can do, so much you can create with technology. I see software development specifically as a mix of art, math, and logic. It's very challenging. It's possible that what I'm working on right now could end up in medical applications, which could save lives. That's very exciting. I love what I do. I wouldn't give it up.
Please join me in giving it up for Thomas Suarez, all the way from the United States, and our very own Fatma Al-Kaabi from the United Arab Emirates. Thank you all for being with us, of course. Thomas, you made it out all the way from Los Angeles. Quite a long trip. Just before we kick off, I want to sort of remark on the fact that we have here again an inventor from the United States, an inventor from the United Arab Emirates. That's really what this summit and what this whole sort of idea of future partnerships is all about. It's bringing people together, bringing inventors together, creating a platform for people like Thomas, like Fatma, to interact, to share ideas that hopefully help to shape our future. So, I mean, it's remarkable, I think, when you think about your ages, at least from my perspective. Thomas, you're 17, Fatma, you're 15. Already you have, inventions. Thomas, in your case, you have patents. I'm sure this has been asked before, but I have to focus on the why. What is it that at this age makes you so passionate about having a real impact, about creating, about inventing? Why do you do it? Thomas?
Sure. I think when you see a problem or you experience a frustration in the world, it makes you want to innovate. It makes you want to solve that problem. So, like in the case of my Orb 3D printer, I had a 3D printer, and I was really frustrated with the speed and also the difficulty to modify the printer. So creating a new 3D printer that would solve those problems was really the answer to that.
So would you say that it's much the same way if we look at, I guess, the general history of where innovation comes from, in terms of humanity, this idea of a need, or we see a problem, we need to solve it. Would you say, is that at the essence of what intrigues you, interests you?
Yeah, I think it's solving problems, solving challenges.
What about you, Fatma? I mean, You made a solar backpack, amongst other things, the robot we saw in the video. What inspires you?
I would say what inspires me is seeing the youth in the UAE and how they work very hard to achieve and make things happen here in the UAE. And I believe we're the generation of today and tomorrow. So why wait for tomorrow? Start from today and work to make our future better.
You hit on a point there which I think is crucial, which is that I think any of us at some point in our lives, whether we're youth, whether we're adults or older, we have ideas. But taking those ideas and then making them real, making them tangible, seems to be where a lot of people hit a wall. So what do you think it is? What qualities, what have you seen, what elements in your environment have allowed you to push through from the idea, from the frustration, to actually creating, inventing something at your age? Thomas?
Yeah, I think definitely the support of friends and family and also the school is very important, and also the support of the internet. So there are so many internet resources out there. The open source movement has just introduced so many resources for young entrepreneurs and innovators to start, to figure out how to do different things in science and technology. You can download people's code, you can download other people's works in science and technology and build on top of them. So the internet is huge in that sense, but also definitely friends and family is important.
Would you say the same thing, Fatima, that it comes down to, obviously there are lots of things, there's programs at a very high governmental level, but would you say the core is family, is the people closest to you? Is that your experience?
Yeah, we want people to support us when we're there on stage and we're sitting at home and working. Because usually people support you when you're very successful, you're on TV, you're in newspapers. We want people to support us from the beginning of our journey. So if I didn't get the support from my family or my friends or from my school or the community around me, I wouldn't start to invent and do things like that. So it starts with support from the family and the people around the innovator.
But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Fatima, I think when you did start, you didn't necessarily have such widespread support. So how did that change?
At the beginning of, I would say, my really short journey in innovation and the things I do, I didn't get support from my classmates, my friends, my really close friends, and my school. But my family was very supportive, and I think my family helped me go through this because they moved me into another school, and my school now is very supportive. Because see, at a young age, you start working, you're exploring, learning new things. So when you don't see the support and you see people teasing you for the things you do, or like bullying you in school, because people used to bully me because I didn't play with Barbies, I used to play with the screwdrivers and things like that. It's weird because, people still make fun of that fact because now girls carry makeup in their bags. I carry screwdrivers and screws till now. I just make sure if anything is wrong anywhere I go to. So it's just the fact that you need the support to do that, even after a while of starting.
But that changed when you started getting newspaper articles and TV coverage, right?
Exactly. My teachers are now very proud. The teachers back from second grade and third grade. I remember meeting one of them. She's like, "I watched you on TV. You're famous now." Like, yeah, I remember when you told me I couldn't make it on that stage. Because I remember I wanted to present, to become a TED speaker a few years back, and one of my teachers told me I couldn't get there and I won't do it until I'm above 30. And I did it when I was 13. So I was happy to actually include her name in the speech and tell her, "Oh, hi miss, I made it on the stage." So I'm glad that happened.
And Thomas, I mean, to a certain degree, I think you had maybe a similar experience, right? You had your first TEDx talk at 12 for a very funny app, Bustin' Bieber, which is basically like whack-a-mole hitting Justin Bieber. Is that essentially it?
Yeah, that's people seem to like hitting Justin Bieber, so I think that's why that went viral.
But what changed for you? So again, 12 years old on a stage, and I've seen the video. You really command the stage, which is really impressive. what difference did you see before and after that video, that moment, and how did that change things?
Well, I think, yeah, definitely before the TEDx talk, I was working on my software projects. I had started the app club that I mentioned in the TEDx talk, and I was just doing normal software development and learning. After the TEDx talk, so many opportunities opened up. So I got so many requests for interviews and flying everywhere. And most of the stuff I turned down just because I wanted to continue doing software development. If I'm flying everywhere talking about software development, I'm not actually doing it. But it was, I think, the TEDx talk and getting the publicity really did help with more opportunities. But the core, the essence of what I do has not changed.
So I also want to take opportunity. You two have spoken together before. You've had, this is a really nice, unique opportunity again to have people from two very different parts of the world collaborate. I think collaboration is quite central to being successful in invention in your field. What are some of the things maybe that you've discussed? What do you see as some of the benefits of having that kind of different perspective? Fatima?
You get to meet people from all around the world, you get to know about the latest technologies, about smart people who are there, maybe not very famous, but you get to know them and know how smart they are. So it's more about, sharing knowledge and learning from other people, and having summits like this to actually get youth together and many other summits outside is a very great chance to meet people like Thomas and other people smart like him.
And Thomas, I think you have a very direct example of collaboration and giving back in some ways when you're interested. Didn't you start a programming club at your school again at the age of 11, something like that?
Yeah. So when I joined the 6th grade of my middle school, a lot of students were asking me how to code. They say, how can I code too? I want to write apps. And of course, this isn't a 5-minute explanation. You really need a lot of time to master, to learn and master programming. So I started an app club at my middle school to teach other kids how to program.
And what did you get out of that? Is it something where you're just giving back? Did you find that had a benefit to you as well?
Oh, it definitely had a benefit to me, and it still does, because I'm still operating the continuation of that idea, and it's definitely mutually beneficial to teach someone, because they teach you also. Even though you might not think, oh well, I'm teaching this person a certain subject, they oftentimes will have other ways of doing it that I have not thought of before. So I'll teach them this one concept in programming, and they say, well, why can't you do it this other way? I'll be like, oh, yeah, that actually makes sense. I should try that. Let's go ahead and try it. So it's mutually beneficial.
Now, I think there's this idea that sometimes, perhaps incorrectly, that technology and innovation sort of go hand in hand. I'd be interested to get your perspective, because both of you obviously work using technology. Would you say that technology is fundamental to your ability to invent or innovate, or do you see it more as a tool, perhaps?
To me, it's a tool. Maybe for me and Thomas, we really need it because we innovate in the technology field. But that does not mean that if we don't have technology, people would still not innovate and get into this field.
So what do you think is the fundamental thing then? Why innovate?
Find a bigger cause to innovate. Don't just innovate for yourself. Innovate for the country, innovate for a problem you saw or something like that. So innovate for a bigger goal than just yourself.
We talked about this a little bit, roundabout, but I want to focus in very specifically on a negative stereotype, shall we say, about your generation. Oftentimes there's this concept that millennials are entitled, they've been maybe coddled a lot because they've grown up in greater security than perhaps other generations, that they are maybe quote-unquote lazy. Would love to know what your perspective is on that idea. Thomas.
I don't know. I think there are so many different resources out there for people to innovate. I don't know about laziness, but I'm not sure actually.
Well, I mean, I guess, so would you say that that kind of maybe stigma, though, do you think that is a hurdle for youth? That if nothing is expected of you, then maybe you don't give anything?
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I mean, I don't know, sorry.
It's okay. Fatma, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, you said lazy. We may be lazy, but to prove it to you, go outside and see the youth who made the summit happen, who volunteered here, who are working in the workshops now. This is the biggest proof to show that youth can actually do something.